Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Rice from Austria, and I'm excited to have Sydney Thomas, who works at Precursor Ventures as a principal, where she has check writing abilities and focuses her time on investing and supporting pre-seed companies that democratize access to products and services for the mass market economy. Prior to her work in tech, she served in the Bloomberg Administration in New York City. She managed public-private partnerships for the New York government, Department of Education, and Office of Financial Empowerment. Sydney had done an MBA from Berkeley and a BA from Duke. Welcome to the show, Sydney.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So you have an interesting journey. You grew up in San Diego. You worked in the government. How did that came about? Working in the venture capital. What was your growing up days in San Diego all about?
Yeah. So I'm originally from San Diego. Spent was born there and stayed until I, left for college. And growing up, I was one of those rare kids in that, I actually had no idea what I wanted to do. And I was pretty open about that. I feel like all the kids, when they're like 5 or 6, I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be president. I was just like, let's see. And so I didn't really have I was kind of, I guess, ever since I was little, I've always been one of these people who likes to just observe, take in all the information I can, and then make the best judgment I can after I've received all that information. And somehow I knew even when I was little that I didn't have all the options. They hadn't given me all the options of what I could be yet. And so went to Duke and studied anthropology largely because, went into it thinking I was going to study anthropology largely because I thought that civilizations were just so interesting. I thought people were so interesting and weird and unpredictable. And I was like, well, if I can study this, I think I'll have some really interesting, I thought it was just, I'd get some really interesting insights. And so started down that path. Then once I got into it at school, realized that I needed something a little bit more applicable, or wanted to study something a little bit more applicable to what I'd be doing after school, and got really excited about government work. I have a lot of family members who work in government, and I was so intrigued in my anthropology work around how much government can really influence society and create haves and create have-nots through legislation. And so I got really deep in learning about that. Interned with Congresswoman Barbara Lee while I was in school, and really wanted to work in Capitol Hill after I graduated. I applied to over 100 jobs there, and I got not one. And so I was like, okay, what do I do now? And luckily, my college counselor told me about a role in New York City government working with the Bloomberg Administration. And I applied, I got it. And so I packed my bags and moved to New York City after graduation, and really just spent those 4 years in New York studying, I think, a lot of public policy, not just from Bloomberg, but also my colleagues who were working in government at that time, and was so intrigued around how both the private sector and the public sector can come together to build really interesting solutions, that I decided that I needed to learn a little bit more about the private sector. So that's when I came out to business school, came back, to my home state of California, went to Berkeley, and spent those 2 years running around San Francisco, really just interning at as many places I could find, talking to as many folks as I could to understand where I could make the most impact in the private sector, and realized that the VC world was actually one that was really engineering and funding an entire generation of businesses. And so how awesome would it be to be in that role where I'm really having this huge decision-making capacity to influence what business will look like in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Decided to go into venture capital and did the same thing I did when I was looking for my job in Capitol Hill, emailed hundreds of folks, and got a few responses back. And one of those led me to to my now boss, Charles Hudson, and have been at Precursor Ventures ever since.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super interesting journey because it shows you've done the kind of hustle to figure out where you want to be. And you started off as an intern with Capitol Hill. Do you think it's an internship at a VC firm is like a perfect job to get into the VC world?
I think that being an intern at using an intern on the Capitol Hill as like a prerequisite. Yes, thank you. You read my blog post. I really liked it. Was like a really cool kind of like putting those two things together for myself when I reflected on the work that I did when I was an intern on Capitol Hill. I realized that so much of what I was doing there was responding to lots and lots of people. Like Congressman Berkeley represents pretty much all of the East Bay. So hundreds of thousands of people I'm in charge of, or not even in charge of, but I'm a liaison for Congresswoman Berkeley too. And in addition to that, the issues that they're asking me are not easy answers. They're not easy questions. They're asking me really intense questions like, what's going to happen with healthcare? What's going to happen with this legislation that's coming down the pike? And so I didn't have any really easy answers either. And so a lot of what I learned there was how to understand really large ideas and translate them back to folks who might not be in the room when all the legislation is getting written. And I do a lot of that in VC too, where I'm translating like, what does AI and ML actually mean? Like unclear from just saying like AI or ML. How do I translate that to folks who might be building something in AI, but just don't know how to talk about it, that they're building in AI. And similar to the large swaths of folks responding to them, because we're a pre-seed fund, there's actually not that many of us, and pretty much everyone can have an idea. And so we get inbound from pretty much everyone who's had an idea and wants to talk to us about it. So that means hundreds of emails a week that I have to process. And I think the large part too, though, that I picked up from being an intern in Capitol Hill too, is that just like focusing on the long game is such an important piece of this puzzle of being a VC. And it was the same in DC. Like when you get there, you might have a law that you want written tomorrow. It may be written in 5 years from then, maybe, probably like 10 years. And so how do you get there, build capacity, build relationships with folks across the aisle, understand what they're looking for, figure out how to communicate your idea. And it's so much like that in the VC world, where we're working with companies that are, pre-seed when we meet them. And so their ability to really influence a large swath of society is probably 10 years from when we meet them, because they'll need additional funding, they'll need to grow, they'll need additional people on the team. And so it's a really similar, I feel like I picked up some really awesome tools when I was on the Hill that I still use today.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. And how can new VCs build a track record? Is it possible to build a track record without any capital put in, just to be a network?
Yeah. So I think that it's been interesting to see how different folks do this. I think that you see some people will blog about companies that they're excited about. The way I took it was I actually decided to build a podcast around the types of companies that I was interested in. And that was my way to really start understanding, why am I interested in these companies? What are they building that kind of piques my interest? But also, how do I communicate their stories so that other people can understand why they're so valuable? And also, how do I start kind of putting some, some breadcrumbs around what types of things I was interested in years ago. Like literally, this was like 2018 when I started the podcast, so that I can track these companies along the way. And it's been so awesome to watch their growth. Actually, one company that I didn't end up interviewing, but that I was tracking early on, Honeybee, just announced a fundraise today. They just raised a $5 million seed. And so it's just been really cool to have had a kind of roster of companies that I was rooting for, that everybody else knew that I was rooting for in those early years, and be able to communicate how successful they have become over, you know, the almost 5 years since those initial conversations.
Right. And when it came to the podcast, were you also inviting the founders of the companies, or were you just talking about the thesis of what the company is all about?
Yeah, so every time I had a number of segments. It was a lot of fun. It was kind of like a childhood dream. I'd say I don't have many dreams when I was a kid, but I did have a dream to be a radio broadcast host, because I thought it sounded like such a fun job. And so I had a few segments. One was like breaking down what the VC term of the week was to the general public. One was kind of like an intro about why I was excited about the company. And then each one also had an interview where I interviewed the founder of the company that I was really excited about, and shared what they were building with the general public.
Interesting. And I want to talk about Precursor Ventures. What is the thesis for the firm, and are you sector and stage agnostic?
Yeah. So Precursor Ventures is a pre-seed firm. We are generalists, and so the thought process is that we're doing about 20 to 25 deals a year, and so pretty active fund. And the goal is to be a journalist, partly because the stage in which we invest is already so risky of pre-seed that adding an additional layer or dimension of industry could really, I think, negatively impact our returns. And so really grateful that we've had really awesome success in that. We have raised 3 funds now, and have worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs, and it's been a really fun ride.
And I wanted to understand your thoughts on the TAM at Growth today. Do you think when you assess opportunities, how important is TAM at the beginning of the idea of the product?
Yeah, I'd say that's a big focus of ours, in that we're interested in having in investing in companies that have access or are interested in touching a large market. And I think how we really evaluate companies is focused on, are you also building are you building a novel business to address that TAM? Because I think that what we see often is that, this takes us back to like the Uber Lyft stories, where there'll become a space where there's a lot of different companies basically doing honestly the exact same thing. And so the only differentiation is oftentimes price, which just means that, or marketing, which just means that then the founders are investing a lot of money into marketing. And what we want to see the founders invest more on is, the product and their people and all these other pieces. And so what we're really excited about are companies that are attacking more novel industries, so that they have a little bit more room to grow, to pivot, to bounce up against things, and they're not kind of like every day worried about, the person who's running running on the track right next to them, and how might they beat them out on the Google AdWords for the day.
Interesting. And when it comes to early stage investments, when do you look at unit economics, and when do you think is the right time for an investor to focus on unit economics?
I think that, for us, usually a pre-seed, there's so much up in the air still, because literally when we talk about pre-seed, it really is idea stage. And so there usually is not a fully baked product yet. There's usually no revenue. There are no unit economics. Or they're on like some sort of Excel spreadsheet that's basically just a made up hypothesis. And so I think for us, we expect that they'll really start nailing that down once they get to the seed round. And so seed to Series A is a time where they can build out strong unit economics and build out, I think, a really, really strong product market fit. But the pre-seed to seed is really like, how do they get to launch? How do they demonstrate that there's demand for this product? How do they demonstrate that there's potential? I feel like that's really what we're measuring at pre-seed to seed, and that I won't say think you get to unit economics. It really is this refinement of the marketing strategy, of the product, configuration, of maybe it's the packaging if it's an e-commerce product. And so it's a lot more of this tinkering that I think happens post-launch, and once you have the product in market and you actually understand what's working and what's not, which is not pre-seed.
Correct. And when it comes to investments, you talked about it's more to like a generalized fund, but what is the right level of diversification for Precursor Ventures?
I would say that it's hard to really put a foot in a line in the sand, because we have such a wide range of companies, in that we have a cargo drone company, we have B2B fintech companies, we have e-commerce companies. And so I'd say that there are some things that we don't look at, which are companies that are largely if you're selling into school systems, we generally don't invest in those companies. If you're building like a very, very, very CapEx intensive product, the cargo drone company was really kind of like our one shot there. We don't do much of that. If you're building in biotech, we do that every now and then, but very rarely. And so I'd say that, most rules have an exception every here and there, but we generally, I'd say also we don't do a lot of crypto investing. So I'd say there are some things we generally don't look at, but I'd say there's very few things where there's like a hard line in the sand where we would never ever take a look at it.
Got it. And as I understand that Precursor Ventures has a solo GP with Charles Hudson. How do you approach decision making when you're looking at investment decisions? How does the decision making happen with Precursor Ventures?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like most funds are a little bit of a black box here, and I'd say that that's part of the reason why I think Charles was so excited to have the solo GP model, and that there's less of a, when a founder's coming to us, there's less confusion around how to get into the portfolio. It really is, how do you get a yes from Charles? I'd say that I have decision-making capacity as well, but just for a small, tiny fraction of the fund, Charles is really the decision maker for the vast majority of it. And so most decisions route through him.
Got it. And Sydney, you've also been part of Kauffman Fellows, and I happened to look at the blog post that you wrote. Very interesting insight, especially for budding VCs who want to get into Kauffman. But how was the experience at Kauffman Fellows, and would you recommend VCs to look into Kauffman Fellow, being a Kauffman Fellow program?
Yeah, I've enjoyed it a lot. I think that it's been a really cool opportunity for me to build stronger relationships with some other VCs where I feel like because they're so focused on really a cohort mentality and small group discussion, you're able to build, and this Kauffman confidential promise that they have, where everything that's said in Kauffman can't be said outside of Kauffman. I think they've put up some really interesting structures around the interactions with other Kauffman fellows, where you feel like you can really let your guard down, I think, in ways that is not always the case in other programs. And so I really enjoyed it. And I think I would definitely recommend it to anybody who is looking to build some deeper relationships with their colleagues in venture, and also looking to just, I think, get challenged on different ideas, and I think explore how they're approaching their own goals. I think that's another piece of Kauffman where that's been really cool, where they really help you think through how do you want to think about your long-term goals in this business, which I think is really helpful. No, I don't feel like I've ever been in a program before that just kind of sat me down and said, okay, let's get to your goals here. Let's figure out how we actually accomplish them. Even in business school is much more focused on, let's just get you a job and then get out so you can start paying us your loans back, and also can start donating back to us, say with undergrad. But this is a very unique situation where it is much more focused on, how do we really support you and what you want to do.
Interesting. And is Kauffman Fellows a full-time endeavor, or something you could do along with your job?
It's something you do along with your job. It's really like a you meet, I think, once a quarter in person with your class, and in between that you have a monthly call with your cohort. But yeah, it definitely is something you do alongside your full-time job.
Correct. And I want to talk more about hiring, especially for founders who's listening to this podcast. What are some of the biggest challenges founders face when it comes to hiring high quality people for the company? And how should they address it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like hiring is one of the most important things you can do as a startup founder. One of the things that I've seen really, one of the things that I've seen done well is basically, how there's this ABC, like always be closing for founders, for sales more generally. I feel like that's the same thing with hiring, where it's like always be meeting new people who might be interested in your company, who might be helpful to your company, who you might want to work with one day, and starting to create this really long roster list of folks who you'd like to work with you. And so then when you have that actual need, of somebody who could be a great person for that role. And so I think that especially in the early days, there's, I'd say what I see works really well is this constant kind of interest in outreach to people who might be useful for your business, in terms of, with hopes of one day closing them as a candidate. Because I think that when you realize you need someone, especially early stage, you probably need them like 2 weeks ago. And so the hiring process, right? So the hiring process has to be pretty accelerated. If you constantly have a roster of folks who you're cultivating for these roles, you can make that hiring process much faster.
Correct. And it's been COVID has been an inflection point last year, but there have been a lot of entrepreneurs and VCs who moved to different cities, especially places like Miami and other cities. Do you think there's going to be an exodus of investors and entrepreneurs who will move away from big cities, or do you think after COVID restrictions, once it goes away, people are going to come back to bigger cities, and that's where most of the network effect happens, especially in Silicon Valley and the bigger cities?
I think that's a great question. What I've seen happen with my friends is it's not really, hasn't been really like because of COVID, I want to move to, Tucson, Arizona. It's really been like, actually, my parents are in Chicago, they're getting older. I've been wanting to move there for a while now, and I really just saw this place, San Francisco or Oakland or wherever, as a stint anyway. Now's the time. And so what I've seen is actually this acceleration of goals to move somewhere else, instead of this kind of like epiphany because of COVID that I have decided to move to this far away place forever and ever and ever. And so I think that it's really just going to be constantly driven by the interests of the people interests of people more generally. I think it's a really personal decision deciding to move. And I think that that's something that I've seen a lot of my friends struggle with, and it's largely motivated by family.
Yeah, correct. And if you would want to give an advice to a new founder to start a company, where should they start a company? Do you think some of the biggest unicorns can come out of smaller cities as well?
For sure. I think that wherever you are, you can build a business. There's no limit. And I think that's been the cool thing about folks hopping on Zoom right now. I just feel like people are more open to taking calls on Zoom. People are more open to, meeting, not having to do a first meeting in person. I'm talking from a VC perspective, and then, close the deal in person. I think VCs are still very much closing deals on Zoom, and I see that as something that is going to continue going forward. And so I'd say, really, wherever you think you can do your best work is where you should start your company.
Oh, interesting. And you've been a success story, especially in the VC world. But what can be done to support women emerging managers in the VC world so that you have more diversity, especially when it comes to startups and the VC community?
Yeah, I think one of the things, actually one of my founders said this recently, and it was so cool to hear him say this. He was like, actually, I've realized that there's a lot of groupthink on my team, and I need to hire someone different because this is not helpful. I need to start pushing, the boundaries. I need to start thinking about things in a different way. And I think that if more people thought like that, we'd be in a better place, where it's like, actually, there's too many people of the same here. How do I switch it up? Because I think that that's one of the superpowers of the United States, is that's the whole point, is there's so many different people here. And so if you're not taking advantage of that, cross pollination that can happen, you're doing yourself a disservice. And so I think that recognition of this isn't really helpful for anyone but you is, I think, a perspective that more folks could explore.
Correct. And you've been quite active on blogging. You also you're a fellow podcaster, and you also have your own Substack and newsletter. How do you use your blog and podcast to voice, and how do you find the time to put out the content and educate as well as be part of the VC?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. I don't know. I've been working on, actually, I've been experimenting with different support around executive assistants. And so I am just now about to start a new executive assistant program. But what I've been trying to do, really, especially in this month, actually, it's something about September. I'm a Virgo, and so it's my birthday season, is really reflect on how much I can leverage additional help when I need it, instead of trying to do everything by myself. It's just not useful that way. And so I'm trying to do a better job at documenting every single little step that I do, and sharing that with folks so that I can help figure out how to plug people in to my workflow so that I can get additional help. Because I think that when I first got into venture, I mean, I did all of it by myself, largely because I didn't know any better.
Right.
And so I just kind of like trudged through the waters. And now I'm like, oh, actually, and I think part of it too was like I needed to figure out what processes I even liked and what technologies even like were out there. And so now I feel like that I've seen and experimented with so many things from, you know, building Zaps and Zapier to like Notion to Superhuman to Airtable, Evernote. Like I have so many different technologies that I use to help me now that I think what I'm realizing is I need to do better at plugging other people in into those workflows.
Got it. And I've been trying to increase my email following on my newsletters and Substack. Any advice for me on how do I increase the following, and what should founders and investors talk more about on the Substack on the newsletters?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I think conversations that I would like to have more of are conversations around not necessarily failure, but I feel like there's a lot of these conversations around if you want to do this, then if you just do these 5 things, then it'll all be great. And it's just kind of like, no, that's not how this works. This is not how this works. And so these conversations around like, actually, this is really messy. And I think that's the 5 things is both, it's a product because consumers like clarity just as much as I think producers like creating the clarity. Like we don't like kind of the messy middle. And so I think as more that we can talk about how you kind of like figured out stuff when you were in the middle of it, I think the better, because I think that this kind of like, it's over now. And if you just copy these 5, if you just wake up early, drink coffee and like go run for 5 hours, you'll be the best person ever. It's just kind of like, no, that's not how life works. That's not how startups work. Startups are just our life,
Right.
And so they're messy, they're sometimes really ugly. And I think we need to talk about how you get back from those trenches instead of just kind of painting the fairy tale picture all the time.
Very interesting. And Celine, I quickly want to do the top 3. What's your favorite business book?
Yeah, my favorite business book is probably Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. I think kind of to that point of the messy middle, it's like this understanding of how important it is to talk about your own vulnerability, to be vulnerable with other people, to share things when they're really not great. And this is something I struggle with too. I think everybody struggles with it. That's why you don't see as much of it. It's like, that's actually what leadership looks like when you're talking about those uncomfortable moments instead of trying to do the, bow on everything all the time.
We'll put that in the show notes. And if you could go back in time when you started your career in the venture capital industry, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
I think that I might have gone with the flow a little bit more. I'm very type A, and I think at the beginning too, I was just like, oh my gosh, like all of these things must be done in this order, or else I'm a failure, or like if I haven't done this by this time, then it's what have I even accomplished? And it's just kind of like all of these kind of like hurdles I was putting on my road for no good reason, except I almost needed them to prove it to myself that I could do something. And so I think even like lowering the bar just for myself, to myself, around all of those things, I think could have saved me some really stressed out nights.
All right. And do you have any favorite online tools, example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom?
Oh, my favorite technology is definitely Airtable. I love Airtable. I think it's the coolest. I was actually just teaching our analyst about something in it today, like, because you can do, they have all these different apps integrated into Airtable, which then allows you to just do so many more things around like emailing people directly from Airtable, tracking things down directly from Airtable. It's like, I mean, it really does feel like a Jack/Jill of all trades of the technology. I'm really grateful to use it all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Airtable is one of the most efficient online products, and we'll put that in the show notes. Now, Cindy, what is the best way people can reach out to you and know more about your blog, podcast, and Precursor Ventures?
Yeah, you can always find me at sydney@precursorvc.com. That's probably the easiest way to reach me. I'm not really on Twitter that often, but I'm Sydney Page 10 on Twitter if you want to check out my tweets. I try to share out all of my writing there. So yeah, probably those two places.
All right. Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes. Sydney, thank you so much for taking time speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
Oh, me too. Thanks for having me. This was really nice.